If one were to look for a mirror reflecting the soul of 20th century America, its anxieties, prejudices, tenderness, and contradictions, it would not be found in speeches or monuments, but in the simple living room of Archie. Bunker. By the 7th season of All in the Family, the Bunker household had become more than a sitcom setting. It was a national confessional. Through Archie's outbursts and Edith's gentle replies, the show offered an X-ray of the American conscience in the years when progress clashed with nostalgia and love collided with ideology. Episodes 10 to 13 of Season 7 encapsulated that collision with surgical precision. They exposed the fractures in race, class, gender, and family, using humor as both anesthesia and scalpel. The first story began with a mousetrap, a humble object that quickly became a metaphor for fear itself. Archie at his kitchen table declared war not on pests, but on change. The arrival of Teresa Betancourt, a Puerto Rican nurse from the hospital, was enough to rattle the foundations of his small empire. To Edith, Teresa represented warmth and resilience. To Archie, she represented intrusion. Yet, his hostility masked something deeper than racism. It was the terror of obsolescence. Every time he mocked Teresa's accent or dismissed her culture, what he was really defending was the illusion that his world still had clear boundaries. Men worked, women cooked, neighbors looked alike, and America was safe from the unknown. But Teresa's laughter, her calm defiance, exposed how fragile that world had become. When she called him Poppy, he heard both affection and mockery, unsure whether to feel flattered or threatened. The brilliance of the episode lay in that ambiguity. Archie was not a monster, but a man whose pride and ignorance fought for survival in a world that no longer spoke his language. The dinner table became the arena of his defeat. Teresa served pescado, the Spanish word for fish, and Archie refused to touch it because, as he said, "It's looking at me." His complaint was comic, but it disguised something profound, an unwillingness to look back at the world that was already looking at him differently. In his refusal to taste the new, we saw the entire psychology of cultural resistance, the same impulse that fuels xenophobia and nostalgia alike. When Teresa's brother arrived later and Archie, mistaking him for a violent lover, stepped in to defend her, the story twisted into irony. His prejudice had prepared him for an imaginary enemy. Reality, as always, made a fool of him. Yet when he was punched, he didn't retaliate. For all his bluster, Archie had a strangely moral core, a working-class decency distorted by the noise of his times. Teresa forgave him, and her forgiveness more than any lecture dismantled his pride. The show's genius was its refusal to humiliate him completely. Instead, it let him remain human in his confusion. Prejudice, it suggested, was not simply hatred. It was habit learned through decades of fear, softened only by contact and humility. The following episode, centered on baby Joey's birthday, shifted the battleground from race to generational ethics. A near-death accident on the subway forced Mike and Gloria to confront an uncomfortable question: who would raise their child if they both died? The debate that followed was a sociological X-ray of the American family in transition. Archie, embodying the post-war patriarch, saw guardianship as a right earned by blood and sacrifice. Mike and Gloria, products of the 1,960-second skepticism, viewed it as a responsibility defined by values, not lineage. "You want your father to raise Joey?" Mike asked in disbelief. "I wouldn't trust that man to raise a window." That line captured the essence of the generational divide. Archie's authority was inherited. Mike's was self-invented. Between them stood Edith, the quiet conscience of the family, translating between two moral languages that no longer shared the same grammar. The symbolic heart of the episode was a toy gun. Archie, thinking he was giving his grandson a piece of tradition, bought a miniature machine gun as a birthday gift. In his mind, it was a gesture of love, a token of protection, masculinity, and patriotism. To Mike and Gloria, it was a nightmare, a relic of violence disguised as affection. The argument that followed was not about toys, but about America itself, what kind of values should be passed down and which should be buried with the past. Archie's fury when his gift was rejected was less about the object than about the loss of cultural continuity. "You mean we ain't fit to raise our own grandson?" he shouted. That question was both literal and existential. For the first time, Archie realized that his version of morality might die with him, and that realization, for a man who had built his entire identity on providing and protecting, was more terrifying than death itself. What made the episode powerful was its refusal to moralize. It didn't paint Archie as evil or Mike as righteous. It showed how both were victims of their own certainties. Mike in his liberal confidence was blind to the tenderness behind Archie's mistakes. Archie in his conservative stubbornness mistook rebellion for betrayal. The family's argument over guardianship was in essence America's argument with itself, a debate between progress and belonging, between new ethics and old loyalties. When Gloria later revealed that their chosen guardians, Al and Trudy, were far from perfect, the idealism of youth collapsed into the absurd. "We'll make an anti-dying pact," Gloria laughed, mocking their own anxiety. The humor was dark, but telling. Even the enlightened generation, for all its theories and causes, was just as frightened of mortality and uncertainty as the one before it. A few evenings later, nostalgia came knocking in the form of Bummy Fensell and his wife Dolores Mancini, ghosts from Archie's youth. What began as a friendly dinner turned into a psychological autopsy of male vanity. Dolores, glamorous and self-assured, carried the weight of an old secret she and Archie had shared, an intimate moment decades earlier, back when innocence was cheap and consequences invisible. Archie's panic upon hearing her name was pure theater. An aging man terrified not of exposure, but of confronting the young version of himself who once believed he could do no wrong. His clumsy confession to Mike, "She reduced me, Meathead," was both absurd and tragic, revealing how the male ego rewrites history to protect itself. When Edith eventually learned the truth, her response subverted every expectation. She didn't scream, she didn't weep. She forgave him with quiet grace. "What you did before we were married is your business," she said, reclaiming moral authority in a way Archie could never match. In that single line, the show dismantled an entire patriarchal mythology. Forgiveness, it argued, was not weakness, it was strength. A revolutionary act in a world built on pride and punishment. By the time the fourth story unfolded, the bunker's living room had turned into an arena of pride once again, this time over the shallowest of competitions, a local beautiful baby contest. Archie and his friend Barney, two aging men desperate to prove relevance through their grandchildren, turned innocence into ego. What should have been a laughable side plot became a study in how masculinity clings to recognition. Archie forged votes, manipulated forms, and treated his grandson's face like a political campaign poster. "Cheating's only cheating when you lose," he declared, distilling in one line the cynical ethics of a man who had learned survival from a system that rewarded cunning more than virtue. Edith's quiet disapproval was the moral counterpoint. She didn't scold him, she simply looked disappointed, and that disappointment hurt him more than any argument could. The baby contest episode was satire in its purest form. Beneath the humor about photo entries and rival grandparents lay an allegory for America's obsession with competition. Beauty, success, and victory, everything was measured, compared, and monetized. Even love became a scoreboard. When Archie celebrated Joey's victory as his own, he revealed the tragedy of his character. He could not separate pride from possession. The moment Mike confronted him, accusing him of teaching Joey the wrong values, Archie's defenses crumbled into bluster. He was a man who believed in doing what it took to win, not because he was immoral, but because the world he grew up in had punished losers more than liars. Through all these stories, All in the Family accomplished something rare in television. It humanized conflict without excusing it. It dared to portray ignorance as something relatable rather than monstrous, to suggest that even the most offensive ideas could coexist with decency, humor, and love. Archie was not designed to be admired, but he was impossible to dismiss. He represented the American working class psyche, wounded by progress, nostalgic for simplicity, and haunted by the suspicion that the future no longer needed him. His home was a museum of the old order where every dinner became a referendum on modernity. Yet, through the laughter, one sensed that the show's real sympathy lay not with his opinions, but with his fear, the fear of being forgotten, replaced, and rendered irrelevant. Edith, by contrast, symbolized the moral resilience of ordinary goodness. She was not educated, not political yet. She embodied the empathy that both sides of America claimed to value, but rarely practiced. Her kindness toward Teresa, her patience with Mike, her forgiveness toward Archie. These were not passive acts. They were in their own quiet way revolutionary. In a decade defined by protest and division, Edith's compassion was a reminder that progress meant nothing without mercy. Where Archie clung to control, Edith embraced connection. She didn't argue with the world, she listened to it, and in doing so, she survived it. To understand the subtext of these 4 episodes, one must also understand the America that produced them. By the late 1972, the country was trapped in a crisis of identity. The optimism of the post-war boom had faded into inflation, unemployment, and political cynicism. The same working-class men who had once built the nation's factories and fought its wars were now being told that their attitudes, their jokes, their certainties, their hierarchies were no longer acceptable. Archie Bunker was their reluctant spokesman, not because he was noble, but because he was honest in his confusion. His prejudices were exaggerated for comedy, but they were rooted in something painfully real: the anxiety of a class that felt its cultural capital slipping away. In the episode with Teresa Betancourt, this anxiety took the shape of ethnic resentment. Archie's discomfort with a Puerto Rican tenant was less about race than about relevance. Teresa's very existence, a working woman, educated, confident, challenged the social order that had once made him feel secure. When she stood her ground, smiling through his insults, she symbolized a generation of immigrants reshaping America without permission. The brilliance of the writing lay in its refusal to punish her or redeem him completely. Teresa's laughter, her humanity, her refusal to be diminished, all served to reveal the absurdity of Archie's fear without stripping him of dignity. In that sense, the episode wasn't about racism, it was about disorientation. Archie was a man standing in the ruins of a world where identity had once been simple. The birthday and guardianship story deepened that disorientation. For the first time, Archie faced a moral exile within his own family. The argument over who would raise Joey was more than a domestic dispute. It was a referendum on moral inheritance. Mike and Gloria, with their progressive ideals, believed that love required introspection, that values must be chosen, not inherited. Archie believed the opposite, that love was a duty, not a philosophy. When they rejected him as Joey's potential guardian, it wasn't merely an insult, it was an existential erasure. His world had measured virtue through work and loyalty. Theirs measured it through awareness and empathy. The two currencies could not be exchanged. The tragedy of Archie Bunker was that he wasn't wrong to love his family. He was wrong about the world that no longer paid for his kind of love. The show exposed this tension without preaching. It allowed the audience to sympathize with everyone, even when they were cruel or self-righteous. Mike's moral superiority, though principled, often became oppressive. Archie's ignorance, though offensive, often contained flashes of unintentional wisdom. When he defended Teresa from her supposed aggressor or risked his dignity to protect Edith's feelings, the audience laughed and softened. The laughter became a bridge, the only language left between generations that no longer understood each other. It was this balance of mockery and mercy that made All in the Family not just entertainment, but anthropology. Each episode was a study in how people justify themselves when history stops listening. The Dinner with Dolores Mancini, Archie's old flame, was a masterclass in the psychology of guilt. For decades, television had sanitized marriage into predictable domestic bliss. This episode broke that illusion with surgical honesty. Archie's affair, or near affair, wasn't about lust. It was about memory. Dolores represented the youth he had lost, the charm. He never really had the freedom he secretly resented Edith for taking away. When she reappeared confident and forgiving, Archie was forced to confront a version of himself he no longer recognized. His panic wasn't fear of exposure, it was shame at how ordinary he had become. Yet the emotional climax belonged not to him, but to Edith. Her quiet acceptance dismantled every stereotype of the submissive wife. "What you did before we were married is your business," she said, drawing a moral line that Archie, for all his authority, had never been capable of drawing himself. In that moment, she became the show's moral anchor, the embodiment of a virtue America had forgotten: grace without self-righteousness. By the time the Beautiful Baby contest unfolded, the series had turned full circle from social commentary to allegory. The absurd competition between Archie and Barney Hefner over whose grandchild was cuter seemed trivial, even silly, but it contained the DNA of every American delusion. It was capitalism distilled into a family joke, the need to win, to prove to measure self-worth through recognition. Archie's desperate forging of votes, his manipulation of forms, his belief that cheating's only cheating when you lose exposed not just his moral confusion, but the national one. It was Watergate in miniature, every man's corruption justified by pride. Yet the genius of the episode was that it never scolded him. Instead, it made us laugh at him, then recognize ourselves in him. Who among us, it asked, hasn't been a rule in the name of love or pride? Who hasn't confused victory with virtue? In the end, Joey's win meant nothing. The laughter that followed was tinged with melancholy. Archie's joy was real, but hollow the victory of a man still trying to outshout time itself. For Edith, the win was bittersweet. She knew it wouldn't make him happy for long. For Mike and Gloria, it was another reminder that their rebellion, for all its moral superiority, still couldn't erase the emotional ties of family. The genius of All in the Family lay in its refusal to let anyone win. Every moral victory was followed by embarrassment, every argument by laughter. It was the comedy of democracy itself, a country forever arguing with itself and pretending that laughter equals understanding. Taken together, these 4 episodes form a mosaic of late 20th century American life. They document a society caught between guilt and progress, where love competes with ideology and decency, struggles to breathe under the weight of pride. Archie Bunker, in all his contradictions, became a national metaphor, a man whose bigotry was inseparable from his vulnerability, whose ignorance was inseparable from his longing to belong. He wasn't evil, he was exhausted. The America he knew had promised simple answers, but the world around him now demanded questions he wasn't equipped to ask. Through him, the show revealed the truth that progress is not a straight road, but a loop. Each generation rebels against the last, only to reproduce the same fears in a different language. Edith, on the other hand, emerged as the moral future of the show. Where Archie clung to certainty, she embraced ambiguity. Where he demanded obedience, she offered empathy. She was, in essence, the conscience of a changing America, tolerant, kind, and endlessly forgiving. Her strength lay not in defiance, but in endurance. She taught the audience that goodness was not about being right, it was about being human in the face of anger, disappointment, and absurdity. Through Edith, the show reminded viewers that real progress is not measured in laws or slogans, but in how gently we treat one another when we disagree. By the final scene, the bunker's living room had become a shrine of contradictions. Archie sat in his chair holding a newspaper, pretending not to care that the world was leaving him behind. Edith hummed a song in the kitchen, a melody of domestic peace that somehow survived every argument. Mike and Gloria's laughter echoed faintly from the upstairs apartment, half frustration, half affection. It was the sound of America learning to live with its own dissonance. The credits rolled, and the familiar tune, "Those Were the Days," returned once more, both ironic and nostalgic. It was a hymn to the past, sung by people who didn't yet know that the past was gone for good. The genius of All in the Family was that it never pretended to fix anything. It didn't end racism, sexism, or ignorance. It simply forced them into the open, into the same living room where the audience could no longer pretend they didn't exist. It dared viewers to laugh at ugliness and still feel compassion for the ugly. In doing so, it created a new kind of national conversation, one that was messy, uncomfortable, and honest. Through Archie Bunker, America saw itself not as it wished to be, but as it was flawed, loud, loving, and afraid. And through Edith, it glimpsed what it might still become: gentle, decent, and quietly brave. As the camera faded to black, the applause sounded almost melancholy, like a farewell to a country that had outgrown its innocence, but not yet found its wisdom. Archie's voice lingered one last time, humming the same refrain. Those were the days. It was not nostalgia anymore. It was confession. Those were the days when ignorance could still laugh at itself, when families could argue without disowning one another, when television could hold a mirror to a nation and say, without apology, "This is who we are." The laughter that followed was uneasy but necessary. It was, in the truest sense, the sound of a country growing up.